Officially welcome everyone. I think we're all here now. Thank you so much for joining us. Merci, bienvenue. Merci d'avoir participé à cet expériment. Thank you for taking part in this experiment. I think we're going to learn learn a lot from each other this afternoon. We have 54 minutes to do it in. And I guess without further ado, Talia, is there anything else that we want to say before we let people start? So who wants to start? Which group? Quel groupe aimerait commencer? Don't be shy. You're all going to have to speak anyway at some point.
I guess we could start. So I'm Justin Ramsey. Hi, everybody. I'm the curator at the Polygon Gallery, along with my colleagues, Nicole Brabant and Helga Pakasar, both of whom are here as well. But our work group was the Polygon with the Glenbow Museum. So it was myself, Nicole, Hema, and Jenny, who are all on this call. And we had a wonderful time meeting this morning, really great discussion. So our experiment, or our hypothesis rather, came down to thinking about the ways that we could create engagements that focus on deep change and being in relation to communities rather than growth. A lot of what we do, from tracking audiences to trying to measure and quantify engagements, is based on this kind of neoliberal growth mindset that doesn't actually necessarily reflect our impact or the value that we have to the people that access us. And so we wondered how can we better center communities' ideas and needs as a focus for what we do? Are we able to let go of this need to have repeat visitors, to dig our claws, so to speak, into everybody who comes, and understand and appreciate when our reach is small but important? To that end, our experiment that we're proposing involves taking part of our respective institutions, our respective gallery spaces, deprogramming that part and seeding that space to whether an individual or an organization or a group in our immediate kind of local community that needs a space for some cultural use. We are thinking of perhaps beginning with invitation based by identifying who we would like to invite to use our space and our facility. And then, if that's not necessarily desired, because that's another question we have, what use can we be? What use can we be of who would want to even have use of our space? Perhaps we expand it to accepting, proposals. So there's some overlap here between what we're proposing here and, let's say, like a residency program, except because the focus would be on need, we would want to maybe set out to the maximum amount of time that we can deprogram this space for, and understand that, maybe a group only needs it for a weekend, maybe it's just for a week, maybe it is for the entire time, however long that is. Understanding that as museum spaces, our programs are often quite set and inflexible, and yet there is a need in our world right now to be responsive to what's happening, whether it's to issues of policing, whether it's to issues of climate change. And so how seeding this space to a group, to a partner based on a need, could create, it could create that sense of reflexiveness and responsiveness that's sometimes lacking in our gallery programs that can be programmed for years in advance. So that's our hypothesis and our proposed experiment. In terms of methods of analysis, you know, there are micro and macro ways that this space could be used. But what's really key is that there's a state of openness, and that we're allowing time and space for exploration and for use. Some questions that we are thinking that we could pose very concretely to, you know, would be partners or collaborators or visitors who are using this opportunity would be, for one, how can our institution be present for you? Asking communities, what would you like our relationship to be? You know, who are you and what do you need from an art gallery? Very specifically, in the context of the Polygon Gallery, my colleague and I were thinking of the fact that our gallery is built on Squamish Nation territory, unceded Squamish Nation territory. And not only that, but that it is actually on the site of a village whose name we still know. It steps away from the Capilano Reserve. It's not far from the site of a formal residential school. So we are very embedded in an immediate community. And so they emerged for us as kind of maybe the first group that we would approach as being like, what use would you have for a space like ours? And, you know, for Glenbow, that's different. And for any institution, maybe it starts by thinking about who is, you know, immediately in that context and starting there. One other thing I'll add, and, you know, any of my collaborators can jump in, of course, would be to, you know, work, for example, into our admissions process as people are coming to the gallery, you know, just making note of if this is their first time visiting. Because, for example, if an exhibition had lower attendance numbers than a different exhibition, but a large percentage of those numbers were first-time visitors to the gallery, then that's showing us a really important different metric. It's not about growth. It's not about having more people come to this exhibition than the last one, or this summer being busier than last summer. We could actually see the different ways that we are expanding that's not necessarily tied to a kind of capitalist growth. Obviously, this has big kind of implications and risks for things like the ways that we report to funders and granting bodies. But we also kind of landed on the fact that we have to be courageous enough to even propose taking these risks, because growth in and of itself is not a sustainable thing. And maybe the sooner that we can acknowledge that, the better for us as cultural organizations. I'll leave it there unless Hema, Jenny, Nicole, any of you want to weigh in.
I think you summarized it beautifully. Thank you.
Super intéressant. Very, 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 very exciting. Je voulais juste savoir pour le groupe de Laurence qui partage l'écran de Joyce, qu'est-ce que ça va pour vous? Est-ce que vous aimeriez avoir une petite synthèse en français? Ou est-ce que ça va?
On est tous bilingues.
C'est ça. C'est parfait. OK.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Mais est-ce qu'on partage un peu?
Cool. Quick question: is the sort of metrics that Justin mentioned, are they lower on the screen here, or it was just verbal there? I was just interested in the.
It was verbal. They're in our worksheet notes.
Fantastic. Okay.
Yeah.
Intriguing, guys. So intriguing. You know, it's funny, it makes me think also, you know, when you use the word space, you know, that was sort of, if you remember, the subject of the deep dive too, you know, was sort of what can we reframe, sort of what are the spaces or the new spaces, or how do we even think about the spaces of a cultural institution? And it springs to mind too in this notion, right, that, you know, sort of, are we talking exclusively about a gallery space, or also sort of all of the ways in which that space is loaded, right, with sort of the broader, bigger spaces of reach, of audiences, of digital spaces, of digital reach, etc., you know, which I think, you know, to me sort of speaks to it too, right? That sort of one, you know, all those sort of very compelling questions, right, in terms of sort of what could this space be used for? Like, what do we mean by space? And I think that would be, you know, kind of, again, maybe speaking to the nuance, right, in plurality, that when we say space of a gallery, it's a deep term.
Yeah, I just wanted to, yeah, that's a really great point, Talia. I just wanted to also share that, like, for example, we started with nuance and plurality, but we we went around and we all talked about certain words that we wanted to kind of unpack. Art, culture, accessibility, outreach, community, and experience were all words that we kind of, this idea started by talking about those words, unpacking them, you know, teasing them out as much as we could, and then seeing where these kinds of threads started to, you know, warp and weft together. And so that's how we kind of arrived at this experiment. It started with kind of identifying these keywords that we kind of use very kind of organizationally on a regular basis, and then seeing once we sort of, once we thought them through, where the unknowns were that we wanted to actually understand more concretely.
Fantastic. Yeah. I think it also, sorry.
Oh, did you have a follow-up comment? Talia, go ahead. I don't want to.
No, I sorry. I'm just like, it sparked so many ideas and thoughts that I'll let others, if there's other thoughts, I can jump in a bit.
A last thing I'll share is that, you know, there's another section on how we measure, or how we, you know, method of documentation. And, you know, in the spirit of not attaching strings to this, one thing that we arrived at in this sort of preliminary stage was just a really honest kind of impact statement or testimonial, from whoever takes advantage of this, so that, you know, rather than us kind of leaning over their shoulders or whatever, we just get very honest feedback about what this meant to, you know, the community partner. So that's kind of where we've landed on as a kind of mode of documentation right now. Of course, we're still sort of thinking all this through.
Yeah, no, it's fun. Actually, that's what I was going to mention, is I find like the whole kind of question of metrics that you guys are broaching, and sort of that, like, how do we actually measure? Also, I mean, I just happen to be staring at the word on the screen right now, but, you know, kind of that category of capital, right? You know, I think that there's, if, you know, can we sort of start to you know, we're like through just simple metrics, right? Start to sort of build out new models of sort of capital measurement, right? Where we're no longer now talking about audience numbers or financial revenue, right? You know, which are the often kind of typical metrics of financial or cultural capital, right? But start to sort of find new ways that start to create new pockets and structures that can sort of subvert the typical structures. That's really intriguing. Sorry, I'll
I just wanted to chime in very quickly before we went, so I don't forget, but the metrics thing is fascinating to me too, especially because Justin, your group talks about the fact that so many cultural institutions are tethered to government funding. And so with regard to funding bodies, how do we start talking about new metrics, right? And then and making also that part of their reflection, and understanding that, you know, cultural institutions want to sort of measure their impact through things like making space. So maybe we, you know, it just sort of plants the seed that, you know, we're not islands unto ourselves, and that we do have to, we do collaborate, and we are beholden still, you know, within the sort of financing models that exist currently, to think through to make them aware anyway, that this is something that we're grappling with and that we need their cooperation. You know, and there are historical precedents for that. You know, the emergence of artist-run centers, for example, is sort of like artists and other actors within the arts and cultural milieu saying, this is what we need, and we need you to be responsive to this. So thank you so much for that. Okay, well, we'll come back to it because we want to talk about all of this stuff together. So qui aimerait suivre? Who wants to go next?
I can. Okay, so our work team our title is we're actually the PHI Foundation team, and so the participants are Amanda Beatty, Kim Johnson, and I. We are part of the education department at the PHI Foundation, and we have with us two very special guests and collaborator, artist Emily Jan. She has been collaborating with the education department and also with the PHI Foundation for many years. Thank you, Emily. And also Charlotte Jacob McGuire is with us as well in the team. And she is in charge of access at the MAC, Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal. She also is a collaborator with us. She was collaborating with, more specifically with Amanda. She is in charge of a great project called Contemporary Signing Project. And she has been discussing with Charlotte around these issues. So thank you. So our question is, I'll say it in French and maybe Charlotte, you can help me translate in English. Comment on place au centre du musée la culture du handicap et de la surditude?
So I guess it would be, how do we place disability and deaf culture at the center of the museum?
Thank you, Charlotte. So it started out by us talking a bit about our education approach at the PHI Foundation. So our pedagogy is called the Pedagogy of Movement. And for us, it's a way to serve the accessibility mandate of the foundation. So we think about movement in terms of the movement of the mind, movement of affect, movement of emotion, and also the movement of our bodies as they move through the exhibition spaces. So we think about that in the context of group visits, but it can be art workshops, other events. It's always a guiding principle for us. And we've been doing some research in that respect around, for instance, we've been conducting some experiments and pilot projects around somatic learning and how can we decenter language and when we are so we're interested in what happens when you're a group of people interacting and experimenting and feeling the exhibition space in all its materiality and the materiality of objects. What's the role of the educator in that context? So what's going on? Actually, there's all sorts of movement, and as educators, we're trying to accommodate all these aspects of movement and to try to accommodate different learning styles, or also different sensory engagements, or different learning abilities. And we feel we always need to learn more and more about that. So we're doing research, amongst other things, about somatic, the place of the somatic within these guided visits. For instance, we've been working with choreographers and dancers. Sometimes we offer visits that are co-conducted, co-hosted by an educator and also a dancer. So so we were talking about these, but we also have the Contemporary Signing Project that is led by Amanda. So we were talking about all that and thinking about accessibility and and what we're trying to do at the education department. And then Charlotte was talking about the fact that, yes, it's great that we do that in the education department, but it has to encompass the entire institution as well, so that the entire institution is thinking about these issues. So that's why we are forming this hypothesis, very greatly inspired by Carmen Papadia. So how does the museum centers disability and deaf culture within this in the center of the museum? So I think our experiments will continue to be, well, we'll begin at the education department for our experiments, but we're like aware that it has to, we have to always connect these experiments to all the other aspects of the PHI Foundation. So Charlotte, shed a light on this. So, but one way to continue, not start, but Amanda has been working hard on a very beautiful project, and maybe you can talk about it. That can be like one experiment that we're conducting amongst others, but maybe Amanda, you can talk about the project.
Sure, merci Marie-Hélène. Bonjour tout le monde. It's really nice to see everyone. So I'll just summarize briefly this project, this pilot project called, like Marie-Hélène said, the Contemporary Signing the Language of Art. And the idea is to, we're going to be working with a group called Seeing Voices Montreal, and their mission is to initiate collaborative projects between deaf and hearing people. They have a theater base. They teach American Sign Language classes as well. So for this particular project, we're going to be working with American Sign Language, and then the idea is to also expand and include the Quebec Sign Language as well. So to start, we're going to be doing sign language classes for the staff at the PHI Foundation, just to be able to have a basic knowledge, basic communication. And then we're going to be working with one group and a deaf educator, and do a visit of the exhibition. We're hoping, depending on COVID, we're hoping to be able to do this in the fall. Visit an art workshop, and then an exhibition of the participants' work. And we'd like to include the work of a deaf artist as well to lead this workshop for all of our participants for the fall session. So that's the idea. It's a pilot project, but the goal is to then create a relationship with this group, to have them back for every exhibition, and then to also be able to offer sign language visits to the general public as well. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you. I also wanted to add that we're also doing research. Well, I guess my own research is focusing on poetry. I think I conceive the way when we're, for instance, doing a guided visit, when we're in dialogue and moving within the space together, and we're sharing spontaneous interpretations of art. I understand this to be a kind of oral improvised poetry, poetic interaction with the artwork and the exhibitions. And I also write poetry, and it informs my work as an educator. And for me, it's also a matter of access, trying to find ways to talk about art, visual art, that could be maybe offer an alternative to a more conventional discourse about art, and opens up to people who are not necessarily aware or knowledgeable in art history, etc. And I wrote poetry about the work of Emily a few years ago. So that's something we would like to pursue within the context of PHI session, maybe an experiment that Emily and I could conduct. I could, writing poetry, and her, we could, do this together, a bit of poetry, a bit of visual art, and then experimenting with the form together. So Charlotte was talking also about a great artist who writes poetry in sign language and mixes choreography and poetry. So maybe that could be something that would ça rendrait bien, ça enrichirait la réflexion de Emily et de moi. So that's it. Charlotte or Emily, do you have something to add?
I guess I can just add very quickly that I think that within these sort of specific projects that we were talking about, like there's kind of a great, like perhaps a more encompassing theme of just like having the gallery be, and the artworks and the objects and the things presented within the gallery be able to be generative themselves, as opposed to the institution taking a position of sort of handing down knowledge, like what knowledge comes out of it from the participants. But then that opens a whole other can of worms of how is that space, how are people made to feel welcome to that? How are people made to feel safe? And that is something that they are, that's accessible to them, like a more meta sense of accessibility in addition to the specific ones stuff. So just throw that out there.
Emily, if I may, I think you're kind of speaking exactly to the question I had, which was, you know, kind of, I love the idea of kind of centering something within, you know, like that notion of, you know, how do you, the very premise of your question, right? How do you center X in this case, you know, sort of the subjects you propose. And I just wanted to ask you guys a bit more about that, like what that means to you versus, you know, how does one integrate, for instance, you know, sort of deaf culture or, you know, but how like it's a very strong word in a way to center something, you know, it really means it's at the heart. And I just, maybe you guys could speak to that a bit more, because I'm just curious how that works and what it means to you.
Go. Actually, when we were talking about it, I automatically said, like, at first I said, you need to have deaf or disabled artists. It's just a fact, you need them. So that's really where it centers. Deaf and disabled art practices. But also it's kind of, if you zoom out, you see that, you know, you have access to buildings, services, but then you have access to consultation, and then access to discourse. And consultation and discourse are very different because in one, the museum is asking the questions, and the discourse part, the deaf and disabled people are actually saying, actually, this is what we're interested in. And finally, like decision making. So, you know, where the deaf and disabled people truly say, well, yes or no. So that, I think, is like the true kind of, not the true, but the kind of the thing that you not should, but, you know, something that is interesting to think about. So yeah, that's the end of my thought.
I think you can say should in there. I think should, you know, go with should. Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. It was really great to have your perspective and your experience, you know, in our discussion.
That really does give some shape to that bigger question around how does the whole organization center disability, but also honor and make place for disability as a culture, as Carmen had spoken about. So that's very, it's amazing. It's very edifying and helpful. Yeah, thank you. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres commentaires? Is there anything else anyone wants to say right now in regards to the Foundation's hypothesis? Oh, yeah, okay, so then we'll move on to,
our group, yeah.
Yes.
So the screen, sorry, one sec. Okay. So, yeah, I'm gonna read it a little bit, but also we'll delve into a broader discussion with the team.
Amanda, sorry, I think we might be seeing the wrong thing. We're seeing just a web page right now, the PHI Sessions web page.
Okay, let me.
Yeah, just move the this into this window.
Good. Perfect.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Okay, so our conversation revolved around the idea and desire of rethinking cultural institutions as side of commoning if they ought to remain relevant cultural and social change agents. And for this, we would like to provide a quick definition of commoning, which is the exercise of common rights to land use, which in itself is key to groundbreaking further generative work. And so our hypothesis came to be a little bit conceptual, but I feel that this would still make sense within the conversation of within what we will provide later. And so we think that transformative change is contingent on a radical redistribution of power resources between different actors of the civil society. So kind of opening the doors of the art world for it to be more intersectional with other aspects of society. And this necessitates a broader reflection exploring the multiple sides of tension between reformism and abolitionism. And so we cannot exclude that transformative change also means that several institutions will disappear. Just like creative destruction process, new ways of organizing and new institutions can emerge from it. We took this quote as a maybe a reference thought. It is not the means of production that create the new type of humanity, but the new type of humanity that creates the new means of production. And within that thought, I would actually jump here into the methods of analysis, which is power mapping, but more precisely thinking about alternative models of governance that maybe Amanda can expand on a little bit, and we can.
Sure. I mean, that's kind of a more radical thought that emerged at the very end of our working session, where basically we started thinking about, okay, so if cultural institutions are really acting as sites of and practicing commoning, then what does that mean in terms of commoning governance structures? And then oftentimes we strive for democratic models of governance, and we were just thinking that if one of our methods or experiments would be to use a very common tool that's used in activist circles, which is to map power relations, then what it could is democratic governance structures really what we should strive for if our intention is to level relationships of power. So we talked a lot about what it means to bring different actors at the table, and we know very much that in the context of extreme inequalities, like even if we bring everyone to the table and set up around the democratic governance structure, and not everyone have the same level of power, and therefore it's not truly democratic. And so could that be a site of exploration and experimentation as well, to not strive for necessarily a democratic governance, but rather one that would be more actively trying to level relationships, unequal relationships of power. No.
Oui, on peut, but we have them in French, which is fine.
I feel like we really open wide.
Yes. Yes, and so from this, we came up with these, I mean, we can go through quickly these thoughts by, like, for example, mentioning the actors that we thought of, which are associative actors like unions, advocacy groups, activists, and the type of spaces that we thought of would revolve more around land that would be collectively owned, but also collectively structured as well, collectively managed property. And that also revolves around this idea of practicing commoning. And building community land trusts. What else? And so again, our method of documentation, but that could also be a method of analysis, would be power mapping. That is not necessarily that much disconnected from cultural mapping and other community-based tools. And also one thing that we found relevant within that process is to also reconfigure institutional ethics, or the set of ethics that tie together the power dynamics within institutions. And sometimes when we do go through this reconfiguration process, we realize that a lot of institutions do not fit into that set of ethics. And so we urge, or we urge institutions to think about dismantling themselves as a way of regeneration into a new structure. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
Yeah, I feel like we had a little bit of a more of a macro conversation when we compare to the other experiments, which I think is great for Cheryl, and Talia, because you'll get like a really multi-level material here. But the idea, I think it does connect with to a certain way to the experiment that Justin presented, because this team was preoccupied with creating sustainable relationship with the community. But in our case, I guess that the idea here is to think of how can we create a community that is actually involving all the cultural actors, but also civil society actors. It feels sometimes that I think, at least for me, the cultural art world is really much hermetic or insular in certain way. So I guess the idea here is to create sort of like an infrastructure that will facilitate resource sharing and a practice of commoning between different types of actor. And we talked a lot about social economy actors, because we feel like they're a source of inspiration for the cultural sector. So yeah, that's it. We had like some examples that, like 221A, for example, in Vancouver is developing a cultural land trust, which is something that we discussed for a little bit, and we'll all put this in the document so you can have some references in terms of examples of some really innovative and interesting projects that are being built across Canada and beyond.
This is brilliant. This is, yeah, it's a lot to unpack there. And Talia sort of read my bubble in the chat there. There is so much we can work with in what you've articulated here. And I picked up on a few keywords that, I don't think I've ever really heard it anyway within the realm of the art world, which is, or maybe others have, but social economy is so interesting. And definitely I would like to know more about, what that entails. I have my own ideas. It's a very evocative, it's not a neologism, but an idea. So I'd love to hear more about that as we go on. Thank you so much. Do we want to respond to this set of hypotheses or sub-hypotheses? Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I might have a question for the other teams, which is like, if we were to sort of activate all these experiments at the same time, meaning like a more macro one with the projects the experiments that you guys presented, which are more context specific to your working space. I'm just wondering what benefits do you think that could be fostered if we were to engage the cultural sector with the other spheres of the civil society? Do you feel like this would actually benefit your projects? And if so, in what ways? Good question. Yeah.
I mean, I think I would need to kind of think about that and review it a little bit more specifically. With us, we are, I mean, I think that we're looking at the art institution not only as kind of a cultural actor, but also as something that's resourced, as a facility, as, you know, as something that that we could find ways to be generous with. And so for us, in terms of a concrete action, it really is about identifying, you know, making those resources available, and through that, learning how we belong in an ecosystem. Like, it's about, for us, it's about it's rather than saying, this is the role that we can play, it's about understanding from others what our role really is, or what our role should be in order to service our communities. So in a way, just, you know, speaking off the cuff, and obviously this could be, you know, a much bigger discussion. I don't know if I see our projects as simultaneous, because I think that we would understand how we fit into a project like yours after running this experiment first, in a way, if that makes sense, because we're still in a state of understanding, you know, the best use of a cultural organization in these sort of, you know, complex shared cultural ecologies like what you've identified here. But again, you know, maybe someone else from my group could weigh in on that. That's my initial impulse when I hear your question and your hypothesis.
But I don't know if I understood right, but when you were talking about trying to learn from the community what they're expecting of a cultural organization, it's also interesting to ask the people that actually do not frequent your institution why they don't. And I think that this has a relationship to our project, but I do understand the temporality that you just pointed out, and I think that's yeah, that might be right. Maybe they couldn't be simultaneous, but I do see how they could build upon each other, certainly.
Well, I don't think, please don't misunderstand, the point of our project isn't to go back to our community as in our members, as in our frequent visitors. It's really to go back to those who are in our immediate space and do not have use for us right now. That's what we want to understand. You know, when I talk about our community, that's very vicinity based. It's not talking about our community of gallery goers. We do want to understand why certain communities aren't engaging with us, and how, you know, what we need to do. And maybe that's something that's very much outside of our mandate, but something that we need to wake up to. So no, when I talk about communities, it's not speaking about those who frequent us by any means.
I think much of what we talked about was about breaking down the barriers between cultural institutions and external actors, like other kinds of organizations or genres of activity in the world, and deliberately inviting those unfamiliar groups or individuals into our space and throwing the door open and saying, do whatever you want with this space and let's see what happens.
maybe I could just add from kind of our, you guys are like speaking my language. It's like really exciting. I mean, just, my background's like architecture and strategic planning and strategic development, which has often interfaced with a lot of, social impact agencies, and right. And like, how do you kind of synthesize, sort of many forces into solutions, right, that start to optimize and strategically kind of build out, ideas or projects that sort of are very smart in that way, right? That they're not just answering to one, but to many, through strategic thought. But just, I think there's from, kind of through the development of this project, Cheryl and I have had a lot of discussions and with the broader team about, just sort of the notion of, like one of the premises, right, was sort of the crisis of essentialness, right, which maybe is overstating it, right, but, like just, and Andrea Shanto pointed it out too, right, just that in a way, the pandemic accelerated many things that were already in place, but the one thing it did force was a sort of strange confrontation with the gap between what we all more or less felt we were doing as cultural institutions, which was providing an essential service, and then the sort of slap of like, actually, no, hardware stores, yes, gyms, yes, cultural institutions, no, and so just sort of, how do we reassert essentialness, right, was one of sort of the foundational questions. And I think you guys are speaking to it in those sort of different modes. And I think there's a sort of synergy in the sense of, I think kind of how can we start to relate, right? That sort of notion of intersectional value and relevance beyond just sort of the world of art and sort of the gallery goers and such. But I think there's ways to do that sort of directly, right? So how do we forge sort of those pathways of relevance and engagement and collaboration? On the other hand, I think there's also such an interesting model, which maybe speaks to sort of the more, kind of focused proposals that we've talked through of, cultural institutions as sort of paradigms, right, of sort of testing models, right, that unto themselves could be then sort of applied in other contexts, right? So it's not necessarily that the project itself sort of connects to other things, but that in sort of enacting that project, you're actually sort of building a model that could be appropriated in different spheres and different areas, right? That starts to sort of rethink the inherent sort of structural orders of, in this case, an art institution in the art world, but that, that could apply to many other spheres as well. So, I mean, to me, they're sort of connected. I don't know if that's coming through, if I'm being clear enough, but, to me, they're connected in that way, right? That sort of, one, through sort of modeling and experimentation, you're inherently sort of attesting to your relevance potentially, and also the potential of institutions that may have the freedom to do those kind of experiments. I mean, I often think like, like an urban, like a city, just doesn't have the freedom to experiment, in the way that a cultural institution, let's say, might. But an experiment that a cultural institution undertakes might lead to a whole new way of thinking through sort of the city, right? And urban planning, or how consultation happens, or, the notion of seeding space, right? To sort of actors, figures, and asking them, for instance, how do you want to use this? How is the city serving you or not serving you? Like you could imagine mapping the experiment that, Justin and your team have put together into sort of a whole other context, and it's still being totally applicable. So maybe it's sort of art institutions learning from artists, cities learning from institutions, nesting the learnings.
I actually had a question for Emily, if that's okay. Emily, I wanted to know about, because about your experience as a art practitioner, but also as a teacher working within, the university structure, and whether you see artists and, sort of you as an artist teaching as being having any kind of leverage, in regards to these questions.
Wow, that's a good question. I feel like I have not fully had my 100% artist hat on for a little while, like from the beginning of the pandemic. I think, like many artists, I got knocked pretty far off my normal center, and so was doing things that, I don't know, felt maybe, this does speak to the whole essentialness, like immediately necessary, like sewing cloth masks in my studio. I spent all of last summer doing that. But as an educator, I'm relatively new at McEwen. I mean, that has to be said. I don't know the culture of the university super well, especially since I started mid-pandemic and, started online and things. But being back on campus this term, I don't know, I feel like the youngins, I guess, like the upcoming kids in many ways are nimble, like they're still young, like they come into a milieu that has already been both sort of prepared by these generations, and also they're still pushing the envelope on a lot of issues around like equity and representation, you know, like what is considered normal, what experience is centered. So I feel like pretty positive about that. But I will say, like, my overwhelming experience over this last like 3 months or so has been of like tertiary trauma, to be totally honest. Like, they've gone through all kinds of insane stuff. They bring it into the classroom. Sometimes they tell me about it. So I feel like they can't really address what, you know, we can't, not that I'm suggesting at all that anybody in this room is suggesting that we do this, but like, we can't sail onwards and pretend that all of this trauma isn't happening, and then there aren't people dropping dead around us and everything. So I think like that has to be acknowledged first in a way, and then I don't know how we sort of rebuild from there. But I was thinking, because of the way that this was framed last week, essentialness, I'm like, I don't know, essentialness versus importance, I'm not sure. Like, maybe there's a fine but important line there. Like, you know, will you immediately die without the museum? No. But will you long term as a culture just become impoverished and, I don't know, eat yourself from the inside, like, and just disappear, like, without the cultural institution? Yes. So it's like a different set, like it's a different time scale, you know what I mean, in terms of essentialness or importance. And I don't know. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't very well thought out. But
No, I totally put you on the
just,
spot, but that's really interesting, because it brings us back to sort of this very large hypothesis that Amanda Lawrence's group, you know, sort of put forth, and this idea of, you know, you adapt or die kind of thing. And then, you know, how do we reorganize and accept, you know, that some may not survive. I mean, we think about a lot about the sustainability question across the board, and we all know, and, you know, sort of Justin's group said it, right? The neoliberal model is just sending us into a nihilistic void, and, you know, it just can't go on. And so how do we really build in sustainability from the ground up? And I think it's okay, right, that there are some institutions that have that you know, will die, and that there will be other things that come up, more sustainable, more nimble, more responsive. I think we have to be very, very comfortable with that reality. And if it means that, you know, the super tanker institutions, you know, go the way of the dodo bird, then so be it. You know what I mean? Is if it means real progressive change, transformational change, I don't think these things should be talked about as a kind of doomsday scenario. Anyway, just some thoughts there.
And I mean, funding is a whole other can of worms. You did bring up earlier in terms of metrics and the kinds of things that institutions have to be accountable for to their funding bodies. But I think, I don't know, I mean, this is maybe not a problem that gets solved in this room, but it's like there has to be like a longer view, right? And I feel like, I don't know, I mean, I'm recently new to Alberta, but just sort of watching the museums be the absolute last thing that was picked back up and like put back out there, I was like, oh, that does tell you like what the, you know, the something about what the priorities are. But that even if you're not going to die tomorrow without being able to visit the museum, that long term, like you can't, you know, the leaders who dole out the money can't lose sight of how important all of those long-term things are. And you have to keep the super tanker going as well, like even while dealing with all of the immediate tiny fires you're trying to put out, like, or enormous fires, like whatever they are, right? But I don't know. So it's like, I think demanding that relevance from second to second is just, it's just not realistic. It's not realistic for institutions that are trying to span years and decades and centuries even, right? So,
If I may jump in just on this question relating to funding, because we were also discussing obviously the limits of the funding model in the arts. I think this is an issue that everyone encounters, individual artists, arts institutions, But that's precisely why we think that thinking in terms of more of an intersectorial lens is actually absolutely necessary for the future. Because, for instance, Joyce was giving her personal example where she actually learned years later that she could have accessed some resources that were available to her in another sector, but by only looking at the resources that are made available in the art world, it's too limited of a lens. There are actually other resources that could be channeled if we were to have like a more efficient infrastructure that can actually help us build and sustain relationship with other sectors, such as the community sector, unions, like other actors of the civil society. And I think that we can actually bypass a lot of the limits that we encounter in terms of funding if we were to actually take a look at what happens outside. But the thing is, we don't have this knowledge. So there's a huge problem in terms of accessing this knowledge, producing it, disseminating it, and sharing it across sectors. That's all.
It reminds me, I think there was in the conversations, just that notion of sort of, the 18th century version of art institutions, which were in a way meant to sort of, herald and uphold the artist, right, and the role of the artist in society, but in a weird way. And, it kind of perverted itself, right, and actually kind of isolated the artist and art from its connection with society, which was much more sort of fluid and natural sort of prior to the institution, right? That we've actually kind of created the silo ourselves. But it was an interesting, and I think what you're getting at too, right, is sort of in the way that the institution may have done that sort of over the last couple centuries, can it undo that, right? And not only the relevance of the institution, but also of the artist, right? Kind of to reassert the value of the artist within a broader social context, which I think has always been, one thing that came out of the conversations too is just the value of the artist's perspective, right? And the way, sort of that means of sort of creatively navigating the contemporary moment. It's like, we need to look at artists because they're doing it very intelligently. And, that's applicable to art institutions, but really, again, you could sort of say that to almost any kind of institutional body, right? Look at the way that artists are sort of creatively navigating and solving and critiquing and engaging, contemporary forces. And I think it's a very interesting prompt, I think, to think about institutions as sort of serving both the artists again, but in so doing kind of giving broader relevance for themselves as well as the artists.
That's something that we talked about a lot as well. And in terms of how that ties into how artists are also like education, basically art education, how artists are formed. I mean, me personally, I had to go to art school to understand that I didn't want to be a professional artist. And that brought me to work more in the community sector. So I think that's also a role that I think like a different kind of arts education that could be a role that's adopted by cultural institutions as well, if it's not happening in academia.
Just
learning that are more that forms artists as civic agent, or like get them to see their role as civic agent.
I just wanted to go quickly to the point about funding. I really appreciated what you said, Cheryl, about there being precedent for, responsive change to demand. And I just wanted to share, I was talking about funding and granting bodies with a peer, Eli Hurtle at Open Space Gallery in Victoria, who just made the point just to kind of like, remind me something really important, that, granting bodies are not these shadowy elites. Like a lot of the time they're us. A lot of us have sat on these kinds of juries or peers like us. And so, if there's an emergent trend among our institutions that's signaling towards like a new kind of maybe qualitative need, in a way, and maybe this is me getting a little too optimistic, but there will be no choice but to respond to that, because it's so present and so pervasive and can't be ignored. So I appreciated what you said, Cheryl, with relation to like the precedent of artist-run centers, that when there's kind of a collective push, the frameworks that do constrain us have no choice but to shift, but to bend somewhat. And so just to kind of like reinvest that power in what we're doing here a little bit.
I think sometimes we forget, right, that we have collective power, and perhaps a neoliberal framework has us believe that, and so then we stop, so we shouldn't stop. It's just a little bit past 4 o'clock here in Montreal, and I'm wondering if there were any other last comments before we sort of gently wrap this session. I think maybe Talia will want to just talk about the next phase of things a little bit, yeah? Okay, Talia, go ahead.
Good. So stimulating, everybody. Really appreciate all the thinking that you guys developed today. It's really fantastic. And I'm actually really excited to see the documents and sort of dig in again all over again. So maybe just on that note, I think, as we said, the tools that we provided and those templates are sort of there for your use, sort of to the level of detail and articulation you feel appropriate, to sort of how far you guys want to go. Just to give you, again, just some context about how we'll be sort of synthesizing the material and looking at it again, is that we want to pool all of these ideas. And I think, as many of you guys have done, and I think, sort of through the conversation, the notion is, right, that those specific, and it's actually really exciting too, that you're sort of taking it on yourselves. These ideas and proposals you've made are also ones that you want to embark upon, and not just like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if somebody else tried this, or because I think that's exactly what we're hoping for. But having said that, I think also the ways in which they can generalize, right, as sort of experiments and ideas that others could indeed take on, I think is also the idea, right? So that sort of through sharing, we create sort of collective and, all the richer maybe findings, because if many take on a similar experiment, then we really can pool sort of the findings and sort of do comparative, gain a lot of understanding through further probing and such. So, if you guys are able and willing, we'd love to sort of have that version of these, templates, let's say these sort of experiment sheets. So whenever you feel ready, please send them back to us, and we'll start to sort of pool them, as we said. And so where they'll go and how they'll sort of be presented is that, when we spoke a little bit about it, but we're creating really a sort of digital publication space. And so right now we're kind of deep in the throes of sort of shaping that. So that'll be produced in the new year. And certainly, the hypotheses, experiments, and proposals that you've developed will be part of them. We also encourage you to share. I think, we realized quite, I don't think we sort of didn't necessarily intend it, but then very quickly kind of realized that, this is something we're just sort of trying to set into motion, right? So also, if you feel that you have colleagues or friends, right, that might sort of just be interested to sort of, or have an idea, and you're like, actually, that'd be fantastic if you just sort of captured it, with this. So please feel free to sort of send on the tools or the videos or any of the content that have emerged from the 5 sessions this year onwards, because that's really the intention. And then, the digital space will be the platform where we start to sort of aggregate the content and the conversations that we're hoping will continue and persist well beyond these 2 days. So we'll keep you abreast of all those developments. And also, again, just to reassure you that anything you submit to us at this point, it will never become public unless you'll know. And we'll certainly be ensuring that you participate in what becomes public, and that you're, sort of totally happy with it being public and with the version of it that does become public. So, we'll certainly be in touch with all of you over the course of the next few weeks and months and hopefully beyond. And if you do take any of this on, like if these do become actual experiments, please keep us posted. We're super fascinated. And, I think even like you said, thinking about how to document them and also ways that we could potentially support any of that, sort of through ideas or parts of this project would be something really to think about in the way that might kind of feed back into the digital publication and what that form that takes, etc. So please keep us posted as much as you're willing to, because it's really super exciting. So I thank you again. And if there's any questions on that, please ask now, but also, Cheryl and I are available all the time to shoot us an email or give us a call, whatever.
We really want to keep the gift circulating. And so I think probably even if people want to work, you sort of even individuals, you're a team of one. That's also totally fantastic. So if folks, we'd love it if you could spread the love a little bit and mention that if people take it upon themselves to want to jot down those ideas and then share them, and then definitely let us know if you have any experience with these experiments being implemented, so that becomes part of the digital publication. Then it just kind of goes around and around and it spreads out, and then other ideas come in, and like that's the messy space that we want to make through this digital publication, and maybe it'll be artist led. So if there's any other questions, okay, great. Let us know.
I love the Laurence thumb. I'm like, I just need that in my life all the time. I'm like, I just have that in the corner of my screen all the time.
Yeah, this has been incredibly validating and rich, and we can't thank you enough again for applying your minds and bodies in space and collectively and digitally. It's something we just want to keep on going and keep on growing. So thanks again, and let's keep in touch. Bye, everybody.
Merci.
Sounds good. Merci beaucoup. Thanks, everybody.